Good morning. It's 11 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. We've got a full house today. We do have more tables in the back if you want to spread out some. And yes, I would encourage you to spread out some. I understand why that seems. I'm not actually kidding. COVID is rising, folks, so fast that we really need to go back to social distancing. That's why I'm wearing a mask, and I encourage people to wear masks even if you're vaccinated. Because the COVID numbers are so high, it would be real easy to be an asymptomatic carrier. So if you've got an opportunity to wear a mask. If you can be spread out, we can spread out. We're not going to need to shut anything down, but we do need to be careful. Can we turn the air conditioning up a little bit or the temperature down a little bit? However you want to phrase that. We'll work on that. But I do want to welcome you. If you're here at TBC for the very first time, go ahead and raise your hand. We're going to embarrass you and make you do funny things. A lot of times we'll just ask you, it's just a simple question, what's the sin you struggle with the most? You know, we do that. We do that in our small group as an icebreaker. We don't have a lot of people come back to our small group. I'm not sure why. But we will work on that. But if this is your first time here, we do want to encourage you to get involved in a small group. That's really how TBC operates. That's where the heart of TBC is and the ministry of TBC is. So even if you've been here for a while, if you're not involved in a small group, you really are missing out. It's a wonderful thing. And I have a distinct feeling that this battery is not going to last the whole day. Okay. Can everybody hear me in the back? I can project if I have to until we can get a different battery here. But are there any events that you guys are doing or that we need to announce that are going on this week? Last week, there was an announcement about you guys getting together for various card games with different wagering levels and prizes. Is that still happening? Robert, are you guys still doing that?
I don't attend that. I don't play games. But, I do wager.
That it already happened. Who won the most?
The men's table. I wasn't at that one.
Okay. Well, if there are any events, now's the time. As I said, if you're looking for a small group, grab somebody. We can find small groups. Just a reminder that Rick's class, or I should say you are Rick's class, Rick will be returning to undo all the work that I've done and should be, I think it's the second Sabbath in September. So I think this schedule takes us through the first Sabbath in September, and Rick will take over the second Sabbath. I still have not heard what he's teaching. Has anybody? Well, I'm going to put the word out there. If Rick has any guts at all, he's going to do numbers. Because he did Genesis, he did Exodus, said there was no way in the world he was going to do Leviticus, which is great. I love teaching Leviticus. But I mean, I think you guys should petition him and basically say you're not going to show up unless he does Numbers and then Deuteronomy. I think that would be very, very appropriate, but that's up to you guys. Any other announcements that we need to make? Any other ways that we want to continue to make fun of Rick Erickson before he actually shows up in front of us? Okay. What's your favorite holiday and why? Now, for those of you who've been in the class for a while, this is the time when where if I ask a question, you guys begin to talk out loud. What's your favorite holiday and why? Christmas. Why?
Serving the Lord, and it's time that we can express our faith to others.
Okay, good. Again, there's not a right or wrong answer to that. This is kind of one of those icebreakers. Favorite holiday and why?
Thanksgiving, because it's the least commercialized. And family gets together.
Okay. Thanksgiving, family gets together. Other than Black Friday and Cyber Monday, it's the least commercialized.
I don't do those.
Others. Advent. Okay, tell me about that one.
The anticipation and the build up to becoming.
Okay, which starts 4 Sundays or 4 Sabbaths before Christmas. Other holidays.
I like Valentine's Day.
Tell me why.
I like all the love that's shown and I get to treat my bride.
That is excellent. Now, I'm sure you do that on days other than Valentine's Day. Okay, good. Very good. Other holidays. Leap year. Now, it's interesting. Do you guys know anybody who's ever actually been born on leap year? I knew the answer to that question. So you're 20, right?
22. Oh, thank you.
So leap year is an excellent one because that's a birthday. How many of you enjoy celebrating birthdays? Still a little bit. You know, if I were to ask, when I asked this, and I wrote down this question, I'm thinking, okay, how would Patty Lynn answer this? And I know exactly how Patty Lynn would answer this. Patty Lynn would say her favorite holiday is St. Patty's Day, because that's an entire day dedicated just to her. And we have special foods, and the family gets together, and she gets to pinch everybody not wearing green. St. Patty's Day is a very high holy day in our household. And birthdays. I live in a household where we celebrate birthdays. And we celebrate half birthdays. And we celebrate birthdays eves. And birthday weeks. And birthday weeks eve day. And birthday month eve day. So basically, in our house, almost every single day is a holiday. And interestingly, most every single holiday revolves around Patty Lynn and her birthday, or birthday's eve and things like that. But that's okay. I like that. It's a lot of fun. We have lots of cake and really good food. Why are holidays important to us? Why do we celebrate them? You mentioned one, it brings family together. Why else? Say again? So there's this remembrance of whatever occasion is being celebrated. Sure. What about birthdays? Why do we celebrate birthdays?
Celebration of life.
It's a celebration of life, sure. We get to celebrate that person. Well, the reason why we're talking about this is if you've read ahead at all in Leviticus 23, you recognize this is the chapter on holy days. Where did we get our word holiday from? Holy days. So holiday really is a literal translation of holy days. So we're going to look at Leviticus chapter 3, and we're going to talk about holy days. Now, as you are turning to Leviticus 23, I want to ask you guys a question. How many of you remember what blue laws are? What's a blue law? So a blue law is, in general, something that you cannot do on a Sunday. Where did blue laws originate? Do you know why they're called blue laws? The reason they're called blue laws is because they were first written down in New England by the Puritans, and they were written down in a blue book. As they were ordering their society, and they came up with the laws of things you could and could not do on a Sabbath, that was contained in the blue book, and so that's why they became known as blue laws. That's one tradition. The other tradition is that they're called blue laws because they represent things that were considered, again, during the early Puritan times as immoral. You know, that carried in today, there's a blue light district, or there are blue movies. This idea of something blue meaning something that's not appropriate. Okay. Now, blue laws are very interesting. Texas has had blue laws until 1985. You can see a list of things you could not buy on a Sunday because Sunday was set aside. Now, interestingly, as I was doing some research for this, somewhere in Texas, It was illegal to buy a camel on a Sunday. I'm not sure how that one got involved. Another place in Texas, you could not have a colonic on a Sunday. I'm not sure why you'd want a colonic on any day, but to have a colonic is a colon washout. You could not have that on a Sunday. Where do blue laws come from? Not the idea of blue laws, I mean, not the name of blue laws, but where does the idea of blue laws come from? Right, the Sabbath. Blue laws were a way of trying to honor the Sabbath. And so that's what we are going to look at today. Turn to Leviticus chapter 23. And let's see. Mike, you're here. Would you open us in a word of prayer, please?
Heavenly Father, thank you that your word is eternal, your word is sharper than a two-edged sword, and teach us today, Lord, to bow to your Holy Spirit. Help us to have your convictions, help your Holy Spirit to work in our hearts, and help us take action on your word. For Jesus' sake, amen.
So we come to Leviticus chapter 23, and again, we know we're in a different section as far as the author is concerned, because we have that phrase, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them. Remember, we've talked about how that helps us understand how Leviticus is divided up. And so we know that what follows is another important section. It's one complete thought. Now notice what it says in the rest of verse 2. These are the appointed feasts of the Lord that you shall proclaim as holy convocations. They are my appointed feasts. For the rest of chapter 23, that phrase, holy convocation or appointed feast, is going to be seen in various places. So we have to ask ourselves, what is Leviticus chapter 23 about? It's about time. Okay, it's about time. The idea of an appointed feast, the Hebrew word there is an authority setting aside a specific time in order for the people to gather to do something. A holy convocation is a time that is, what does holy mean? Set apart for the people to be called together. Con with vocation is to be called. So it is a time that is set aside to be called together. Now, if we think about it, this should not surprise us. What is the book of Leviticus about?
How to be in relationship with God.
And in particular about how to be in a relationship with God, what has been our chief theme throughout all these chapters?
Holiness.
Holiness. Now, we've talked about holiness. We've talked about holiness meaning set apart. And we've talked about the people being set apart, that the nation of Israel is set apart. We've talked about special places being set apart. We talked about the tabernacle and the Holy of Holies. Chapters 21 and 22, which we're not going to have time to cover today, but it's basically talking about the priests and their special places. Only certain priests could go in the Holy of Holies. Only certain people could join the priests in the tabernacle or in the temple in order to eat the holy feasts. So we've talked about a holy people. We've talked about holy places. What's left? Holy time. And so what we see here in the very beginning is the same God who created the heavens and the earth, who is sovereign over his people, who is sovereign over geography and places, is also sovereign over time. God is going to tell us in this chapter that time is under his control and his authority. And he's going to tell us that in the same way that we use everything else in life and think about it in terms of holiness, our time should also be thought about in terms of holiness. Any comments or questions so far? It's this idea of holy time that is really important. So let's move forward. So one of the things that we recognize through this is that God is establishing special times for Israel to gather. Why? We talked about this. Why are holidays important? Well, holidays remind us of our proper place. You know, first of all, as we see here, the first point of these appointed times and holy convocations is first and foremost is to remind us and to point us to God. And so we are reminded of the things that God has done. We are reminded of God's character, and we are given regular periods of time to reflect upon that. And so we will see one of the first applications of the first understandings of why God sets apart these holy days is to remind us of who he is, his character, and what he has done on our behalf. But the other thing that he does with this is that it also reminds us of our place. And you guys were sharing that when you were talking about your favorite holidays. One of the things that's important and that makes holidays so special is this idea that it's the same thing year after year. Why does that repetition resonate with us? Say again, you have to speak up louder.
Otherwise, we'll forget.
Okay, so otherwise we will forget. Okay, why else?
Anticipation.
There's a sense of anticipation. So the fact that it's regular and repeated, we tend to be forgetful, we become mindful. It gives us the ability to anticipate. What else does it do? There's a sense of security. Why? So build on that. Why does that make us feel secure? And I agree with you, okay? How many of you, when it comes to Christmas, and Christmas is the easiest one, like singing the new Christmas carols? How many of you prefer the old Christmas carols? Why? You know the words. What else? It brings back memories of when? Exactly. Okay? It's not that old music is better music. It's that the older music reminds us of so many things. It may remind us of the first Christmas we had with our own children. It may remind us of when we were kids. It brings back not only a memory of Jesus as being born, it also brings back the memories of our progress through life. It reminds us of the time that we've spent with family. What else happens on Christmas? Okay, how often have you been to Christmas and at some point, someplace, you read the news, you said, this is how they celebrate Christmas in the Ukraine. This is how they celebrate the Christmas in Mexico. This is how they celebrate Christmas in Germany. Why, again, why does that resonate warmly with us? A holiday links people across distances. On December 25th, you know you're not the only one celebrating Christmas. This is a big enough deal that, you know, I think of this. I think of my friends in Estonia, and 8 hours earlier, they had celebrated Christmas. Or I think of Matt and Lou Brandon, who 3 days and 4 weeks ahead of time, because they're in different days and time zones in Malaysia, they celebrated Christmas. A holiday brings people together across distances. And one of the things that you'll notice in these holy days of Israel is they would celebrate it as a larger community. So people, families, and I'm looking specifically at the Hagans, who are all over the place, always come together for holidays. It's a chance for families to overcome the distance. You go over the river and through the woods to grandmother's house to celebrate Thanksgiving. That is a Thanksgiving song, not a Christmas song. So it helps us, it helps us overcome the artificial divisions we have because of geography. And that's really important. It helps us to see ourselves as a larger community. It helps us reestablish our bonds not only with God, but with one another. I mean, I can tell you, one of our family's Christmas traditions would be to get together with the Hagans, and my father would show up and immediately fall asleep on their couch. And their kids to this day still think about my dad falling asleep on their couch. It's a holiday tradition. It's a gathering of people. The other thing it talks about, and you meant is it remember when we were kids, holidays also help us overcome the distance of time. We remember we're not the only generation that has ever existed. There are generations before us that have celebrated Christmas. Even in our households, as we get together, we frequently have multi-generational gatherings, and you have this transmission of ideas, thoughts, concepts from the grandparents to the grandkids. Well, take that even larger, and now we have transmission of ideas across generations, across decades, across centuries. So one of the things that a holiday does, and one of the reasons why God establishes these special times, is to remind us of our place. On one hand, a holiday humbles us because we recognize we're not the only generation that has ever lived. And yet at the same time, a holiday lets us know we are still very important and we're going to celebrate this, because what we celebrate then gets passed down to the next generation. So God gives us these holy days in order to remind us of who he is and what he has done. And he gives us these holy days to remind us of our place in his creation. The fact that God is sovereign over all things, the fact that God does not need us to do anything, does not mean that God does not want us and that we don't have an important place in God's economy. And that's what he is talking about when he talks about these as being holy convocations and appointed feasts, that these should occur throughout all generations. That's why these matters. That's the purpose of these holy days, of this time set apart. In the same way that the dietary laws and all the other laws set aside Israel to be a light to the surrounding nations, these times set aside Israel to be a light to the surrounding nations. Any particular questions or comments on this idea of God's holy days and his sovereignty over time before we start looking at some of the specifics? Okay, let me move forward then. So the first one he's going to bring up is in verse 3, the Sabbath. What is the Sabbath? The Sabbath is the seventh day, okay? What else is a Sabbath? It's a day that God rested. So what is it for us? A day of rest. So if you look at verse 3, 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest. Now, what's interesting, again, is if we were to read this in the Hebrew, it sounds something like, but on the seventh day is a sev that is sevi. In other words, in the Hebrew, all these words are related: Sabbath, seventh, and rest. So when the Bible talks about the seventh day, the Sabbath being a day of rest, what does that rest mean? What does it mean to rest on the Sabbath? So number one, it involves a focusing on God. What else?
And stop doing your regular work.
Now, what do you mean by regular work?
I think the focus is on stopping, but I guess stopping from human effort as opposed to recognizing God's work.
Okay, so, and again, I appreciate you're working with this, because when we begin to focus on what does it mean to stop from work, it then does become tricky. Okay, if I am supposed to stop from work, does that mean I shouldn't be mowing the lawn on a Sunday?
Sunday is not the Sabbath.
Okay. So you're gonna go there, huh? Actually, we are in just a minute. Yes.
The original idea, which I know there's been a lot of talk, extending it more modern. The original idea is they're an agricultural society. So the stopping work specifically was to prevent stopping the labor necessary for production of the house.
Right. So I think a way to think about this, and you're spot on, when you look at what the Sabbath meant to the Israelites, it meant that you ceased from all those things that you had to work to do in order to maintain your general life. So if you were a farmer, you didn't do any farming, okay? If you were a rancher, cooking, you did it the day before and brought it out. So these things that were man works in order to take care of yourself stopped so that you could focus on God. Now, what does it mean to focus on God? If the Sabbath is going to be set aside to focus on God, what does that mean? While you're thinking about it, I can tell you what it meant to me as a kid, okay? I went to one of those churches that on the Sabbath, to focus on God meant you basically needed to be in church all the time, singing and not doing anything fun. That's what it meant to focus on God. Have no fun. That's what I grew up with. I have a feeling I'm not the only one. What does it mean to focus on God?
Part of it would be recognizing God's provision.
Okay, what else?
Thanking, being thankful.
Spending time in thanks. So again, my point here is on one hand, we can say the words, but on the other hand, of what that actually looks like over time is kind of tricky, which is why the rabbis had 632 laws based on the Sabbath. They weren't trying to be legalistic. They were trying to answer legitimate questions of what counts as worshiping God and focusing on God. What is work that we shouldn't be doing? Those are great questions. What happens if you violated in the Sabbath in the Old Testament? You were killed. So if you want to avoid dying, getting further clarification on what counts as work is really important. So that's what the rabbis worked on. What does it mean? What counts as focusing on God? Now, what's interesting is yes, we are thinking about moving this forward to today and kind of what counts. I can remember in college, and Patty Lynn can tell the story afterwards, even better than I can, of college students who would say, you know what, I'm not going to study on a Sunday. Now, this is at an Ivy League institution where everybody's competing for everything, but in order to honor the Sabbath, not in a legalistic way, but in order to honor the Sabbath, from sundown on Saturday to sundown on Sunday, they wouldn't study. And they constructed their weeks those ways. And you know what? Every single one of them had straight A's. No, of course not. Some did, some didn't. The point was not, oh, if I honor God, I'm going to get straight A's. The point is I'm going to honor God and let God take care of everything else. You know, one of the things that Patty Lynn and I try to do with our family, we do try to honor the Sabbath. Why? We're not under the law.
Because we're not. That's brought up there.
Well, when did Sabbath begin? In creation, and in particular, before the fall. Of all the laws that we have, this is the only one that was pre-fall. Sabbath was instituted by God because he did it first, and he was given it, and he gave it to his creation before there was sin. So there's something about the Sabbath that is intrinsic to being created that is really important. We see Sabbath effects before the law. Remember when the nation of Israel left Egypt and they were going through the desert, and God provided, what is it? Yeah, what is it? What is it? Manna means, what is it? This was kind of like who's on first. The word manna means, what is it? So God provided this manna. When were they supposed to collect it? 6 days except, and then one not. Okay, that was supposed to be set aside. Again, that's before the law of the Sabbath was actually given. So if we think about it, the Sabbath actually is much more ingrained into God's society, into God's creation, than just being one of the 10 Commandments. In fact, it's, as we talked about, it's so serious that to violate the Sabbath in Numbers 15 brought death. So it's not just a little thing. So this idea of Sabbath is a covenant time. So the other thing you need to know about the Sabbath is think about the 10 Commandments. Okay? The 10 Commandments. You shall have no other gods other than me. Is that unique to Israel, or does that apply to all people everywhere? All people everywhere. Thou shalt not murder. Honor your father and mother. Don't lie. Keep the Sabbath. Keep the Sabbath was for Israel alone. As a law and as an expectation, it's interesting, Exodus 31, we don't have time to go in there, but one of the things that God makes very clear in Exodus 31 is that this Sabbath keeping was for his covenant people. Okay? God may judge other nations because of murder or idolatry. God doesn't hold other nations to a Sabbath standard. It is unique to God's covenant people.
What was the reference in Exodus?
That's Exodus chapter 31, verses 13 through 18. Any other questions about the Sabbath? We're going to come back to why the Sabbath is a Sunday now and not a Saturday. Just a little bit. Okay. The next feast, the next feast day, the next festival. A festival is a feast day. Our word festival means feast day. Our word holiday means holy day. So the next feast day is Passover and unleavened bread. Okay, verses 4 through 8. When is it celebrated? So what? Why? When did Jesus die? During what festival? Passover. So if you want to know when Passover occurs, just think of when Easter is, because Jesus's death and resurrection occurred during that Passover period of time. So the Passover and unleavened bread occurs in the spring. Now, notice according to the text, it's called the first month. So, in one sense, the Jewish religious calendar begins in the spring. It's the month of Nisan, not the car, but the month. So the Jewish religious calendar begins in the spring, and the first holy day is Passover and unleavened bread. What does the Passover celebrate? Not a trick question. Okay, so Passover is specifically celebrating God's mercy in not killing those people who were in a house in which there was blood on the door, so the angel of death passed over them. What does the Feast of Unleavened Bread celebrate? And this is all in Exodus 12. Right, why did they have to make unleavened bread? Because they were in a hurry. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread celebrates their deliverance from Egypt and the fact that it was in a hurry. So Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread go together. And Exodus chapter 12 lets us know that this was always going to be a special holiday. Because remember, it says, that there's a pedagogical point of this. When your children ask, why are we doing these things, you are to tell them. So again, notice the role of a holiday in the bringing together of generations in the remembrance of what God has done for us. So that's Passover, celebrated in the spring, Nisan 14 and 15, and reminded Israel of God's deliverance from Egypt and deliverance from the angel of death. What's the next holiday in Leviticus? First fruits. When does that occur? Okay, according to the passage, it tells us Feast of First Fruits is the first Sabbath after Passover. Which brings up a point. Some of these holidays are on a Sabbath. Some are not. So for example, when is Christmas?
December 25th.
Every single year, it is December 25th. So sometimes that may be on a Sabbath, sometimes not. When is Thanksgiving? What date?
Thursday.
So it doesn't have a date. It's always on the fourth Thursday in November. So some holidays that we have are always on a certain date. Easter is always on a Sunday. So that holiday always coincides with a Sabbath, as it were. Christmas, on the other hand, is an example of a holiday that changes days during the week, but is always on the same day. Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is always on Nisan 14 and 15. Sometimes that may end on a Sabbath, sometimes it doesn't. The Feast of First Fruits is always on the Sabbath, and it's on the first Sabbath after Passover. So now you can begin to understand why you see some of the language that you see there in Leviticus. Some holidays are a Sabbath, some are the first Sabbath or are not on the Sabbath. Does that make sense? Okay, so the Feast of First Fruits is the first Sabbath after Passover. Now, what does it celebrate? And then somebody said this before. The Feast of First Fruits begins the harvest of the winter crops. And what was the nation of Israel supposed to do with the first harvest? Bring it to priest to give it to God. In other words, what is God reminding of his people every year? This is all mine. It is not yours. I get the first fruits. I get what comes first. I will take care of you, but remember, in the grand scheme of things, I, the Lord, am more important than you are. And these first fruits, they grew because I made them grow for my glory, not yours. And so we have the festival of first fruits. Again, this occurs in what we would say is March, April. What's the next festival? The Feast of Weeks. When does this occur? Seven sevens plus one. So 50 days after the Feast of First Fruits. So we're now in April, May. What does this celebrate?
Giving of the law.
Now, it was used by the nation of Israel eventually to celebrate the giving of the law, because again, if you think of the time frame of Israel in Egypt, you had the Passover, you had the leaving, you had the going through the Red Sea, they were on Mount Sinai, God gives them the law. Traditionally, that was about 50 days later. And so the Feast of Weeks, as it's called, became associated with the giving of the law. So even today, when they celebrate the Feast of Weeks, one of the things they do is they read the law. The Feast of Weeks is now the kind of the end of the spring harvest of the winter crops. And it is a celebration of God's abundant provision. Now notice what you are supposed to do during this time. You are reminded. What are the people reminded to do? To take care of the poor. Remember, we talked about that as an economic provision and how this is what Ruth was all about. The book of Ruth takes place during the period of time between Feast of First Fruits and this Festival of Weeks. And again, this is a reminder every year that when we celebrate God's abundant provision, we are also to share of that abundant provision with God's entire covenant people. Again, the purpose of the holy day, bringing people together across space and time, across economic lines. What comes next? Feast of Trumpets. Now, notice, when does that occur? Okay, from our perspective, it's autumn. It's the first day of the month. Okay, it's the first day of the 7th month. Okay, this is the beginning of the Jewish civil year. So this is the Jewish New Year. And notice it's about 6 months apart. Okay, all of so the first 3 holidays we talked about were in the spring, in the month of Nisan. All of these are in the 7th month, the month of Tishri, so 6 months apart. So you can begin to see how this year is beginning to work. And this is the Feast of Trumpets. What does the Feast of Trumpets celebrate?
Traditionally, it was linked to when God moved his people through the desert. The trumpets would sound and Moses would begin to lead the people.
If you go to Exodus, can everyone hear what he had to say? Just remember, when you're going to speak up. In Exodus chapter 19 in particular, when God first appears to his people at Mount Sinai, it says that his voice was like a trumpet. And in Exodus 19, 16 through 19, this idea of the voice of God being a trumpet is repeated. Anytime God tended to speak to his people throughout the Exodus, there were frequent analogies to the sound of a trumpet. And so this blowing of the trumpet is a celebration of God's voice with his people. Now notice, this is one of those celebrations that is treated like a Sabbath, no matter which day of the week it falls on. Okay, the New Year's may be on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, go on, but whenever it occurs, you're supposed to treat it like a Sabbath. And that's why he told us what a Sabbath is at the very beginning of these. What comes after the Feast of Trumpets? Day of Atonement. We've already talked a lot about the Day of Atonement. The point here is this is on the 10th day of the new year. So now you can begin to see how some of these holidays interrelate. You don't just jump from nothing to Day of Atonement. You've had nothing for 5 months. Now you have the Feast of Trumpets, because everybody knows what's coming in 10 days. So it's a way to begin to prepare the people for what for them was the holiest day of the year, the Day of Atonement. This was the most solemn day. If you notice, on this day, if you didn't keep this day like a Sabbath, you were killed. Not only, but on this day, you were supposed to have been fasting. This is a true day of no fun. Okay? There is to be no frivolity on this day. Why? Because you're supposed to be focusing on your sin and need for forgiveness. And if you're not, God will cut you off from his people. So this was the highest, most solemn event of the Jewish feast days. What's the last festival? Feast of Tabernacles, or Festival of Booths. This is in the 15th day. So notice, the spring celebrations were all grouped together. The fall celebrations were all grouped together. The spring celebrations were linked to the harvesting of the winter crop. The fall celebrations are linked to the harvest of the summer crop. And Israel had 2 rain cycles, 2 growing cycles. This all fits in to the geography of Israel. And what does the Festival of Booths commemorate? The Exodus. So again, notice how often these are commemorating the Exodus. Why? Okay, deliverance for who? The people getting Leviticus. Remember, we're looking at this about 3,000 years later. These are the Israelites on the plains of Moab. These events that they're commemorating were about 2.5 years ago. Now, as the nation's life continues, they will add other holidays. Okay, they will add Purim, for example, in the book of Esther. But the reason why these are all commemorating their deliverance from Egypt is because they just experienced that. And this deliverance from Egypt is going to be huge in the religious life of Israel through the millennia. Because of all the events in the Old Testament that point to the Messiah, the Jews' deliverance from Egypt is the most parallel of what the Messiah, who he would be and what he would do. And so you see this repetition of aspects of the Passover, of aspects of the deliverance that they're supposed to follow. Any questions about this? And notice how, again, this ends with a reminder that these are the holy convocations, the appointed festivals for all generations. Yes, Cora.
What is the Feast of Trumpets, the difference with the regular Sabbath and the Feast of Trumpets?
So the Feast of Trumpets could occur on any day during the year. And it was a celebration of God's presence with the people, of God's talking with the people, and it was essentially the beginning of the Jewish civil New Year. It's their New Year. Now, one of the things that we've said is that everything in Leviticus points to Jesus, because Jesus says, I came to fulfill the law. So now let's take a look and see how Jesus fulfills these. First of all, the Sabbath. Matthew, come unto me, you who are what? And I will give you rest. So what we see as a picture in the Old Testament, we see fulfilled in Jesus. Now, a couple of other things that are interesting about Jesus. What did Jesus tell us about the Sabbath?
the Lord of the Sabbath.
Number one, Jesus was the Lord of the Sabbath, and on multiple occasions he proved that. Number two, he tells us that man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man. So again, that's why the Sabbath has one of those unique intertwinings with us as people. We recognize, according to Paul, you're not supposed to judge people according to how they keep the Sabbath anymore. Notice Paul, and nowhere in the New Testament does anyone ever say that the Sabbath has stopped, that somehow the Sabbath principle no longer applies. Okay, so somehow this idea that, well, now we're in the New Testament, the Sabbath principles, the Sabbath rules, the Sabbath laws, well, they don't apply to us anymore. That's nowhere in the New Testament. And in fact, it's if we think about it, as we said, it was given before sin, and it reflects the very character of God. It was present before the law. All the other 10 commandments we say are still in effect: murder, don't lie, have no idol. Why would we think that the Sabbath law is no longer binding on us? Particularly when Jesus himself says it's for our benefit. So why did we switch from celebrating on the Sabbath, which would for us be Sabado, the Sabbath, to Sunday, Domingo, the Lord's Day? Why did we switch? The resurrection was when? The first day of the week. So when do we celebrate? When do we have our Sabbath? The first day of the week, because we are looking back at God and his resurrection, and which is essentially his new creation. So the early church very quickly shifted, and the important meetings of the early church were on the first day of the week, our Sunday. That's how we shifted. You good with that?
Well, I think I've read scholars are kind of divided on the extent to which the church switched to Sunday, because there were times when the disciples met on
The Sabbath.
the Sabbath.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why did Paul say don't judge one another based on Sabbaths?
Yeah, the whole idea of should we be celebrating the Sabbath on a Saturday or a Sunday? Why did the church change? It's very interesting. There's a lot of literature out there. Suffice it to say, we should be celebrating the Sabbath, and we'll move forward. In fact, it's so important that even Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9 talks about there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And we'll come back to that. Okay, Passover. What did Jesus do with Passover? What is communion? Right. Jesus was the Passover lamb, but notice how Jesus took the Passover and turned it into a celebration of the new covenant. Jesus transformed Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread to our communion. So in that sense, we can see how, yes, the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread really did point to Jesus, and he turned it into communion. First fruits. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Jesus is specifically spoken of as the first fruits from the dead. He is that celebration. What day did Jesus rise? The first day after the Sabbath following Passover. Festival of Weeks. What is another name for Festival of Weeks? Pentecost. Pentecost, 50 days. When did the Holy Spirit come and settle on the disciples of Jesus? Pentecost. Now notice, the people were already celebrating Pentecost. Pentecost is not a Christian holiday. Pentecost is a Jewish holiday that Jesus transformed. Now, what's interesting again, go back to John And you remember Jesus' conversation with the woman at the well. And then the disciples come and say, what are you doing? You remember Jesus talks about, look under the fields that are white for harvest, pray that the Lord would send forth laborers. When did Jesus say that? About 50 days after Passover. Because if you go back, John chapter 3, Jesus and Nicodemus, that whole story was at Passover. After that Passover and the incidents that Jesus had, he then went back to Galilee and Samaria. And it was during that time, fairly soon after Passover, that Jesus meets the woman at the well. And it was during that time, about 50 days after Passover, that Jesus makes the comment, look under the fields that are white for harvest. Feast of Trumpets. We would call it Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is the Day of Trumpets. And if you go to Revelation chapter 1, and John is speaking, and he's getting this revelation, and he says, there was somebody who spoke behind me whose voice is like a trumpet, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 10. And he turns around, and who was speaking to John? Jesus. So Jesus's voice is like a trumpet. Jesus's voice was present at Mount Sinai. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Well, Jesus combines it with Passover. Jesus' atoning work on the cross, Good Friday and Easter, occurred during the Passover. So what we celebrate as Good Friday and Easter is basically Yom Kippur. Good Friday, the lamb that is killed at Day Kippur. The resurrection is the lamb that is alive and takes away the sin. And the last one, the Festival of Booths, Jesus, one of the first names of Jesus in the entire New Testament, Matthew. Jesus is Emmanuel, God tabernacling, succothing with us. So we can see how these festivals really do apply to us. You know, the Festival of Booths was a festival of Thanksgiving. We celebrate Thanksgiving. You know, we celebrate Easter, which is a celebration of Passover and first fruits and Day of Atonement. You know, in the same way that God sets aside time for his people to be holy, and Jesus makes time special, we as Jesus's body should also make time special. Number one, I do think we need to ask and have a conversation of how we celebrate the Sabbath today. Because throughout the Old and New Testament, it is not a question of if we should celebrate the Sabbath, it's how. So what does that look like? Recognizing that Jesus gives us some freedom in how we celebrate the Sabbath. Recognizing that Paul says differences in how you celebrate the Sabbath should not be a source of contention. We should not judge one another based on that. If somebody wants to say, hey, listen, I feel comfortable mowing my lawn on Sabbath, great. Let's have the conversation, though. It's important for us to have a Sabbath. If it was important enough for God to rest on the seventh day, who am I to say that I don't need a Sabbath regularly and frequently? And then secondly, I can say, be like Patty Lynn. Get as many holidays in your life as you can. Holidays are wonderful. Holidays are an opportunity for us to reflect on God. Holidays are an opportunity for us to reestablish family relationships, to reestablish relationships among the body. We should be celebrating the holidays. And why can't we celebrate Passover as Passover? How many of you have been to a Seder dinner? excellent. Really cool, isn't it? You know, the same God that rescued Israel is our God who died on the cross and was resurrected. We can celebrate Passover. It's really cool. It teaches us the same lessons that it taught the nation of Israel. So some of these Jewish holidays, absolutely, we could be incorporating. Not because of a legalistic need, but because, wow, what a wonderful way to have a party. Let's find another thing we can celebrate. Holy days or holidays should be a regular part of our life as individuals, of our life as a family, as our life as a small group, and as our life as a community of believers within the church. They're for our benefit. They equip us to glorify God even better because we take the time to be refreshed, to be rejuvenated, to be revived, in order to, again, be reminded, because we need to be reminded of who God is and what he has done on our behalf. And he's done it not only for us, but for all those who have come before us and for all those who will come after us. And we can be holy too, because of what God did on these holy days. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you that you're a God who likes parties. You're a God who likes festivals. You're a God who likes holidays. Lord, you give us time. You want us to take time to celebrate, to partake of your abundant blessings and enjoy them, and to share that abundant blessings with others. So Lord, I pray that you would give us wisdom in how we can best understand and celebrate a Sabbath, how we can best understand and celebrate these holy days, these feasts that remind us of who you are and what you've done on our behalf, and that we can truly be a light to those around us because of the celebrations they see us having, as we are your people. We are your children. In your name we pray. Amen.